Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all here. I'm Lois Winter. I'm chairman of the York County Historical Committee, which sponsors this series, wearing the red shirts. I think you are all so wise to come today. So wise, because, I forget that everyone isn't as crazy about history as I am, but I think it's so important to explain and understand where we came from and why we're here. And so today, you're going to hear something that is very hard to hear anywhere else, because Tim Smith is an expert on this particular subject, which is people from York County who fought in the Civil War. It's not anything you can go look up. So you're very wise to come and hear this, because you're going to hear this exceptional information. Just let you know, if you've got the brochure that looks like this, that's put together by the Sesquicentennial Committee, it also has in it other events that are upcoming. And there's this sheet also, which has the rest of our series. So if you come back in August, it would be August 19th. The next one is going to be about TAP. And again, I think it's local experts explaining local history. It's local knowledge, it's information not published anywhere else, that these certain people have spent their lives collecting this information and are going to share with you. So the next speaker is Robert Emerson. He's right there. Wait, Robert. And he is a super expert on TAB and the halfway house and everything that ever has happened in TAB, just as Tim Smith is a super expert on the Civil War and the events of the Civil War. Tim also does reenacting, and he has been in movies and TV shows, so he is very special. So I'd like to welcome you all to welcome Mr. Tim Smith. So they don't interrupt us. Thank you.
Thank you, Lois. First of all, I'm not an expert. A friend of mine, Robbie West, always likes to say all the experts are dead when the last competitor died. I don't consider myself an author. I don't write. I haven't written yet anyway. And I'm not really, I'm a local historian, I guess. I don't consider myself a professional. There are professionals out here, and I have a lot of respect for them. So dispel all those things. I spend a lot of time looking for photographs, and I've done it for about 25 years now. Les Jensen got me started on them back in the 80s. I met him when we were filming a miniseries called George Washington with Barry Bostwick. And Les was on the set as one of the military historians, and they ignored him, but we had a lot. They ignored him as far as the movie went, or the show went, but he spent a lot of time talking about images, and he was working on his regimental book on the 32nd Virginia at the time. So he said, if you ever come across any images, let me know. And we stayed in touch, and I did find some. So I started working on the regimental series books and did images for about 10 of them, and I'd send them to the authors when I'd locate them. So that's where I got started. I didn't have a camera, so I would have to go borrow the image from people and take it to a professional studio. And I didn't like doing that because these are one-of-a-kind images. They're very, very valuable, not only to the family, but as an image itself. And so then I got a camera, and I started learning how to do photographic copying work. And now when somebody asks me about an image, I've got about 14,000, so I have to go through, and they're not categorized. I don't have a secretary. And Susan knows, because I sit behind her recliner in the den. There's 8 boxes of them sitting there. She just vacuums around and doesn't say anything. But anyway, I love images, and I love looking for them and finding out where they are and what they've got. So I've spent a lot of time doing that. The other person that was influential in my interest in this is Dad. My father, next to the refrigerator in our kitchen, he had a cabinet, and he had the records, copies that back in the days when you went and did everything on microfilm. He and Frank Carmine used to go out to Richmond, and he had copies of the rosters of the 32nd Virginia and some of the other units. And I would dig those things out, and they were huge documents, and I would go through them, and I would see killed at Sharpsburg, wounded at Sharpsburg. And I think, what in the world is Sharpsburg? So then I started looking further and found out that the Yankees call it Antietam, we call it Sharpsburg. And that perked my interest in that. So since about, I guess, 1984, 85, I've been trying to track down images. We find out there's a lot more of them than we thought. And so we tell the story of the war through these gentlemen, through their images and their units as much as possible. And there's going to be a lot of people I'll leave out because There are a lot of men that served there are no images for, or the images have been lost. There were probably more images that existed at one time. And I was able to, when I started, I was able to catch the grandchildren of the men that served when I started, the great-grandchildren. And a lot of the people that let me photograph these images are not with us anymore. So if there's any way to dedicate something to them, I think it would be to these people, because they're the ones that shared the history with me. From York County, Upper and Lower York County, there were several units that the men served with for the most part. For the cavalry, it was 3rd and 5th Virginia Cavalry, Old Dominion Dragoons, and James City Troop. For the artillery, they served in some cases with the James City Artillery, which is a heavy artillery unit. Most of them served with Peninsula Artillery, and that changed names. The artillery units would rotate according to whoever commanded the unit. It started out as Cosnahan's Battery, Peninsula Artillery, then it became Page's Battery when they fought at Sharpsburg. And after Sharpsburg, they consolidated the units and became Jordan's Battery, Bedford Light Artillery. They took 2 guns. A battery would be 4 cannons for a Confederate unit. They took 2 guns of Peninsula Artillery because the units were small. They combined with 2 guns from the Bedford Artillery, and they put them under Captain Jordan, and they became the Bedford Light Artillery. And they fought most of the war like that. And the end of the war is Smith's Battery, no relation, Bedford Light Artillery. So the men that were at Gettysburg from York County were in the cavalry, and they were in the artillery. The infantry wasn't there. So I walk up and somebody would say, "Oh yeah, great-great-granddad, he died at Gettysburg." And so I'm thinking, I find the record, great-great-granddad, he never left the peninsula. You know, in some cases, when they withdrew, he stayed home. And there's no shame in it. That was just they want to look after their property. That was just the reality of things. There were 2 militia units they served with pre-war, and those units melded into the regular Confederate Army units. The 115th Militia, Virginia Militia, which was most of York County, and the 68th Virginia Militia, which was Upper York County, James City County. And then men served mainly in the 32nd Virginia Infantry. And we had at least one that served in the 6th Virginia, and a few scatterings and others all over the place. But they're all men from here in the county. I've never used one of these laser pointers, so I hope I don't bring a plane down while we're doing all of this. Just a few statistics, and these are things you easily look up. 1,082,119 men served in the Confederate military forces. Of those, 260,000 died in service. Probably, in Allied stock, probably 1/3 of those were actual combat, and probably the other 2/3 died of disease, I would say. And for both sides, 1 in every 7 adult males served in the military at some point in the 5 years of the war. Well, these guys up here, for the Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania part of the Eastern Theater, they can pretty much tell the story. I'm going to go to the artillery first because they're the most confusing. And this is George Washington Smith Peninsula Artillery. What we believe is Peter Green Peninsula Artillery, William Pettit Peninsula Artillery, and Leroy Riley Hogg Peninsula Artillery. Now, the interesting thing about Mr. Hogg right there, the family I shot it in lives at Pocosi. He was actually from what we call the oil refinery property. That's where the family started. And he had 2 other brothers that served. One of them, Addison Hogg, was a teacher, and after the war, he did a lot of volunteer work in Richmond in his summers when he wasn't teaching. He ends up donating his images to the Museum of the Confederacy. This image, however, is in the family. It's an ambrotype, and it's a pre-war image. An ambrotype is a glass image, and I think some of the prettiest images you see from the period are ambrotypes. Leroy serves through most of the war, and as some of them do, he eventually gets tired and comes home. And he deserts in January of 1865 into the lines in Yorktown. Now, some of the guys would come home, try to slip home and visit, and they get caught. And they would take them to Fulton Row, and they do have to swear an oath of allegiance, so they would take them to Fort Delaware, Point Lookout, and lock them up until the end of the war. Anyway, Leroy comes home, takes the oath, and goes home. His brother Addison, there's a uniform image of him in the Museum of Confederacy, which I don't have a copy of because I haven't paid for it. You got to buy them there. What's interesting about this unit is they start out as Peninsula Artillery, Cosdan's battery. And I think around March of 1862, in the Confederate Army, you can vote your commanders out if you don't like them. And Cosdan wasn't liked, he gets voted out, and Page gets voted in. So then it becomes Page's battery. And they fight at Sharpsburg as Page's battery. And after Sharpsburg, they get melded into the Bedford Light. They don't even have enough forces to tow full artillery crews into Maryland for that campaign. So in a lot of cases, they leave some of the guns behind, and they combine units so they can get all their guns up there for the fight. So they fight at Gettysburg as Bedford Light Artillery. On the second day of Gettysburg, it's 3 days of battle, the Alexander's Battalion Artillery charges into the wheat field, into the peach orchard, rather, and goes into action. So that's 6 batteries times 4, so it's 24 cannons with horses charging in the field, unlimbering and going into action. And at the end, at some point, George Washington Smith and Peter Green are both wounded. And they're following the Mississippi Brigade and Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade, and they take these guys from the Mississippi Brigade to one house that's a hospital for them. There's a tenant building behind the hospital, and the artillery guys, for some reason, are sent over to the tenant house, and 10 of them die there, and he gets buried at the tenant house. The guy that buries him is a black man. He's a freed man, probably with previous burial experience, and he labels headboards for all 10 of the men. So George Washington Smith, and I'll start with him, he's a relative. He has on his headboard G.O. Smith, Jordan Battery, York County, Virginia. So there's no doubt that's who it is. And the 10 men are eventually moved in 1870 to Hollywood Cemetery to the Gettysburg Dead Section. Peter Green, he gets wounded so badly, he spends a little more than 6 months in the hospital, Chimborazo. They work their way down. Chimborazo Hospital is now a National Park building, or a site, and the Oakwood Cemetery is nearby. He survives and he comes home, and since they were both the only 2 wounded in that battery, I have a pretty good idea the shell probably burst in front of them because of the way the wounds read in their records. And George Washington Smith dies of his wounds, and Peter Green survives his. William Pettit comes back to the peninsula in 1862, and he dies of some type of disease, probably typhoid or smallpox at home around April of '62. So he doesn't ever really get away from here. And as we said, Leroy Hogg, he deserts in '65, January, and comes home. So those are our artillery gentlemen. Over here with our cavalry guys, we have Richard Whitaker and Samuel Pettit of the James City Troop. This fellow goes into the western part of the state and becomes a scout. That's John Pettit, brother to Sam. This is Billy Tennis, 3rd Virginia Cavalry, Old Dominion Dragoons. So Richard Whitaker, great uniform image. We know that's the uniform. Oh, I know you guys can't see very well, so we're going to bend that around something. Richard Whitaker is wearing the uniform that we believe was the uniform that the Old Dominion Dragoons started with, and they were a pre-war unit. So they were a pre-war state militia unit, and they had issued these nice uniforms. And I've seen 3 images with the same uniforms. So he starts with the Old Dominion Dragoons, but he ends up serving with the James City Troop. He dies, let's see, Richard dies in '62 of typhoid fever around Williamsburg. He's from the northern part of the county. And there were 2 Richard Whitakers, him, and he has a brother named Richard also. So I don't know how Mom did that. It's Richard C. Whitaker is this one, and there was a Richard Harwood Whitaker. And they were brothers. So I don't know, she had to have nicknames because if you yell Richard, they both come. It just didn't work. Or Mom wasn't very ingenious, and she said they were close enough in age, she just called them both Richard. I don't know. One of those family things. Anyway, Richard, Samuel Pettit, he goes through, survives most of what he's killed in the valley, and it doesn't really say what conflict he's killed in, but the Pettit family, I went to see Bill Pettit and photographed these images, and his son, Bill, passed away just, I think, about a year ago now. And Bill's got images of 3 ancestors that served, 2 of them that passed away during the war, and they're on our monument out front. And I'll get to the other Pettit in a little while. There was another Pettit that served with him with last name that had one T short of the others, and he was not related. He also dies in the war. So we have 3 Pettits on the monument. 2 are brothers, the other one's not related to them. But they owned what they call Plot 1, Number 1 in York County up by the pottery. And all that field, all that land up there at one time was the Pettit family farm. And they ran a store and various other things. So it was a very, very interesting family. It was a nice family to visit. And that's what I would do. I would find or call, or somebody would give me a hint where an image might be, and I'd call the people up and say, I'm not crazy. I understand you might have so-and-so. And people were very welcoming, and they would bring other documents out when I go to the homes, letters and different things. And I would photograph those. When I first started doing it, I would also take a tape recorder and tape the people, and I stopped doing that because I don't know why. I just did. I should have not, because, again, those people are gone, and they would tell me a lot of history. I went to see one lady, and everybody had an ancestor that served with Mosby. Mosby had about 500,000 cavalry. And you'd hear that, oh, he served with Mosby. So I went to see this one little lady, and we photographed her grandfather's image, who actually was Charles Holtzclaw. And Charles ends up being the surveyor that resurveys Hampton, and so they can rebuild Hampton after the war. He's in a uniform, but she didn't realize it because privates don't have any insignia on their uniform. They just wear a jacket with 7 or 9 buttons, and it's called a shell jacket. And he's wearing a slouch hat, which looks like similar to a rough cowboy hat. So she didn't realize it was a uniform image. It was. And she looks at me and she says, well, my other grandfather served with Mosby. Good. 500,001 now he served with Mosby's cavalry. And she goes, and Charles Holtzclaw's from Fauquier County. Well, that's where her family's from, and that's Warrenton. That's the right area for Mosby. She brings a shoebox out and starts opening it up, and she pulls out the slip. Well, I didn't handle it because I didn't have my white gloves with me, and I said, and on the slip it was an exchange receipt where her grandfather had turned a prisoner in, a Union prisoner into Mosby, and it was signed Colonel John Singleton Mosby. So I'm glad I didn't say sure, but she had a whole box of his letters and receipts and things, and he had served. And again, he's from the right area to have served with him. So never, when somebody says that, never say, he didn't do that, because we don't know. Another wonderful person. Going back to the cavalry, this Pettit never shows up on rosters with the cavalry units there, and you'll see, and we see them in reenactments sometimes, these guys will show up wearing neckerchiefs, and you never see those on uniforms anywhere. I've only seen 2 of all the images I've ever studied, but John Pettit's wearing one. And he goes out in the western part of the state, and he's like a special scout, so he doesn't show up on rosters, but he's in a uniform. He doesn't show up on a standard regimental roster. So I don't know if he's one of these guys that's kind of back and forth behind the lines or what the story is, and he stays out in the western part of the state after the war, and he's buried out there. He's the one brother that survives the war. Billy Tennis right here, I called, the Tennis family moved to York County before the Civil War, and 7 or 8 years after the war, they moved back to Hampton. They were from Hampton, and they opened a bottling plant, and they bottled Tennis and Crockett pop. And the Tennis's and Crockett's intermarried while they were in York County. Anyway, Billy Tennis had joined the 3rd Virginia Cavalry, and in those days, in most cases, if you wanted to serve in the cavalry, you had to provide your own horse. There were no horses provided by the military. And he rode home, not realizing that the Dare area, the Railway Road area, had been occupied by federal troops. So he rode home, sees federal troops. As he dismounts, gets back on and gets out of there. The 1st New York Lincoln Cavalry had just come through to find that the Confederates had abandoned Ship Point Works. So anyway, that's Billy Tennis. He gets detached as an orderly in '62, and he doesn't show back up on a regimental record, which means he's probably in the hospital system, either at Chimborazo or maybe even in Lynchburg, working as an orderly. Again, they wouldn't show up on a regimental return, but it seemed like it would be records. But he survives the war. And I've seen that with several men where they detach as orderlies for some reason, and it's something that's always needed, and they don't come back to their parent unit. Before we move on to the infantry, are there any questions right now?
Was the cavalry Pettits kin to the artillery Pettit?
They're brothers.
So all 3 of them brothers?
Right. This one, and this one are all brothers. And this is the only one that survives, John. questions? All right, I'm going to go over and talk about a group of men that all knew. Most of these guys all knew each other. One of them, though, leaves the peninsula. I think he's probably in Portsmouth doing an apprenticeship, and that's Lemuel Ironmonger, Bonnie's direct descendant. Lemuel, this is Lemuel right here. He joins early enough that they actually outfit themselves. He's got what they call a tarred canvas cover on his kepi for rain, very unique item. And they prepare themselves to go up to Harper's Ferry for the hanging of John Brown. So he's in the military early enough to be part of that. I think they're either mustered to go or they get there. Brown's already hung, so there's no point being there, and they come back home. He missed the hanging of John Brown. And anyway, he's in a full, what they call great coat. It's an early war image. Lemuel, I believe, is about 5'4", very short fella. But he was so good, he went up to corporal and then he made sergeant. 2 days after he made sergeant, he gets captured at Spotsylvania Courthouse. He goes to Fort Delaware and spends the rest of the war there. He writes some nice letters home. He talks about who's at Fort Delaware with him. He's got, he said, I'm here, I've got Bill Smithers from Hampton. Bill Smithers was in the Hampton, Washington Artillery of Hampton. They get joined into the King William Artillery known as Carter's Battery. They also get captured at Spotsylvania. The whole battery gets captured. They go into action to repel a federal assault at the Mule Shoe, and before they can get unlimbered, the Federals are surrounded and taking the entire battery. I think just a few of them escape. So Bill Smithers is there, and he said Judge Armstead's son from Williamsburg is there with him in Fort Delaware. And if I remember right, Lemuel ends up getting a job as a cook. He does something with food, so he's able to get them a little extra food and survives the war. But he's got some wonderful letters. I got to go to Fort Delaware a few years ago and work on a film project. So to walk the post there, it's a very desolate place. It's an island out in the middle of a river. The river's very rough, so I ever got out there. There's a huge burial ground where the prisoners were buried. And I don't think other than one central marker, there are no markers for it. But that's Lemuel. Lemuel writes letters back and forth with Kenny Carmines. Kenny's on the left, Ben Hunt's on the right from the coast, and Kenny's a clerk. So Kenny goes in, and he's a clerk before the war and a teacher. He's very astute. He realizes he starts the war in the 115th Militia, so he's not paid. He's stationed at Ship Point. He writes to Lemuel Ironmonger, who's over in Portsmouth with the Independent Grays, 6th Virginia Infantry, and he says he's figured out that the officers at Ship Point are turning in the paid soldiers on the regimental returns and adding the militia who are not paid to the same roster. So what he's basically doing is saying, all right, we've got 40 paid troops here, and we've got 20 that aren't paid. They're writing them down as paid. So they're getting payment from the central government in Richmond for 60 men. They're keeping the other 20 and just paying the 40 that are paid troops. And he caught on to that. And his letter starts out, he said the officers are robbing our government. He caught on, being a clerk, he could see the returns, and he knew that they were turning in receipts for men that didn't exist as paid troops. So he catches on to that. But he ends one of his letters, Kenny, back to Lem, with the term I thought was kind of a modern term. He said, I'll see you, it's either I'll write you sooner if not later, or I'll see you sooner if not later. So they correspond back and forth. At the end of the war, Kenny is captured somewhere between Five Forks and Appomattox. He doesn't make it to Appomattox. He's the only one that's grinning in an image. So he must have been a real character, because you don't see that in Civil War image. You never see anybody smiling. It's just, the photography was early and you didn't smile. Nobody smiled. But he's got a smirk on his face. Plus he's wearing an officer's cap, and he wasn't an officer. So I don't know if that's part of why he's grinning, like he's got one over on somebody or not. But he refuses. They ask him if he will help sign paroles and fill out paroles, and he refuses to do it. So they put him in Libby Prison in Richmond. And after the surrender of Appomattox, he's still in Libby Prison at Richmond before they finally release him, because he wouldn't help sign paroles. Ben Hunt, also a Potosan, and this is the only peninsula image I've seen of two men seated together. Ben's a corporal and then becomes a sergeant, and he gets wounded in action at Sharpsburg. He kind of just disappears as the war goes on. He disappears off the roll. So when I highlight one thing about them, it'll be about that individual. There's actually a lot more in the record about where they were and what they did. But Ben was a sergeant, and what's interesting about this image, this one, John French White right here, and Hardy Warnham, is I'm pretty sure they were all taken at the same studio in Petersburg. John French White writes home in a letter, and he says, "I'm sending you my likeness," which is his photo. They don't call it photographs, my likeness. And he's got a distinct back of a chair right there, and the same back shows up in this image, and this image, and in this image. And they're all stationed in Petersburg at the same time, so they probably got together as a bunch of guys would do and say, "Hey, let's go get our image, our photograph done." So John French White documents that. Now I'm going to skip to John French White. John French White fights through the war. He makes sergeant also, so the regimental stripes are very similar on both uniforms, and they're wearing, I believe, what they call second Richmond Depot jacket in these images. Anyway, John French White is another person. He teaches Sunday school. He's got a brother and a brother-in-law that go to war with him in the same unit. When they finish at Sharpsburg, he writes a lot about the Battle of Sharpsburg. And he talks about, in fact, there are 4 written instances where at the Battle of Sharpsburg, the 32nd Virginia, much downplayed as far as numbers. They don't go into Maryland with the numbers that they normally would have. And anyway, in a matter of probably 2 or 3 volleys, as they come out of the West Woods, they're shot all to pieces. And there are 4 written accounts of most of them being head wounds. They said so-and-so got hit in the head. Robert Forrest, where's Robert? Right here, talks about the flagstaff being shot through, talks about the flag being shot up, and having the brains of his comrades on him. So there are 4, I know at least 4 written accounts where the men were shot in the head. And those are the things, when I was looking through Dad's regimental returns that he had copies of, I kept seeing killed at Sharpsburg, wounded at Sharpsburg, killed at Sharpsburg. And as I learned in reenacting, when you fire a volley, especially a lot of troops at Sharpsburg were still, for the Federals, were relatively green and not been in action, they tend to fire high. So either in the first or second volley, they decimated the 32nd. They lost around 42% of their troops were killed or wounded in a matter of minutes. So they send them to Petersburg, so that's why they're not at Gettysburg. And while they're at Petersburg, that's when they sit for their portraits. Any questions at this point? All right, I want to highlight very quickly the men. Robert White's killed at Sharpsburg. Henry Watkins is killed at Sharpsburg. Silas, it's either Silas or Elias Cox, because he's wounded at Sharpsburg. Which one of the wins? Yeah, John William Wynn, he's killed at Sharpsburg. Arthur Shields, he's wounded at Sharpsburg. Elijah Buchanan is killed at Sharpsburg. And that's just out of that one group of men. And so that just gives you an idea of how decimating it is. And when you have a group, sort of like a National Guard unit from Bedford, that gets shot up so badly during the D-Day invasion, and it really affects the community. When the word started getting back and how many men from York County had been killed or wounded, which took days then to do, they just found out how bad it was. And it shot them up so badly that they were never sent to Gettysburg. They pulled out of Pickett's division, which they were serving in, and they sent them to Petersburg and they replaced them with another regiment. There's some accounts. There's a 3rd Virginia Cavalryman that talks about riding after the battle to a barn on the south side of Sharpsburg and finding the wounded from our area in there. And he says, so-and-so is wounded, so-and-so's there, he's already died. So-and-so's there is critical, and I don't think he's going to make it. And so he talks about the different men from the area and how badly they've been shot up. And then John French White here, after the battle, he buries his brother, Arthur Bennett White, and his brother-in-law, John Sidney Freeman of Poquoson, near the church. Of course, I'm sure the bodies were disinterred and moved to a cemetery at some point. But Arthur Bennett White's son had been born, and he went up there after the war trying to find the grave. And they said I think he drove a Model T up there years later to find it. And one of the interesting things about him is he couldn't drive in reverse. So they said the shed he parked the Model T in had an opening at both ends so he could drive in. It took him 4 days to drive to Sharpsburg in a Model T, something we do in 4 or 5 hours now. Let's see, we go through. This is William Haney Warnham. William Haney Warnham, when I photographed the image, I assumed that this darkening on the eye was a blight in the image. And then I saw a post-war image of him with Esther Warnham's photographs, and he had a scar there. So when I looked at his record, he's wounded in Sharpsburg. He's wounded in the eye. So he's, again, that's another situation where he was caught in those early rounds. See, this fellow right here is Billy Storrs. Billy Storrs goes back and forth. Sometimes he's, before the war, he lives in the Fox Hill part of Elizabeth City County, then other times he's in the Tabb area of York County. So he's back and forth, so we kind of consider it part of York County. But he's the captain of the New York Rangers. He's an excellent officer. He serves through the war, and just before the end of the war, Billy Storrs is captured right after the Battle of Five Forks. On his way, there's a long retreat from Five Forks and Richmond and Petersburg to Burkeville Junction on to Appomattox. Of all the men up here, Hardy Warnham right here, half-brother to this Warnham, he's the only one that surrenders at Appomattox. So that just gives you an idea of all these guys here. He's the only one that actually does a surrender. And it's been said that he arrived home on his 21st birthday and would walk home. After the war. This win and this win, I believe, are brothers. There were a number of wins, there were 7 or 8 of them that served in different units in the war from the area, and they were all related. These two are brothers. And Edmund Wynn, he gets killed, he gets wounded at Sharpsburg, and he gets killed at Drury's Bluff in 1864. So he doesn't survive the war. James Forrest here, we were just talking before the program. I have him listed as James Forrest. I don't even remember who brought me the image to shoot. It might have been Frank Carmine's.
Yeah, me.
I shot it right there. Anyway, James is listed on the Regiment of Returns as John Forrest, and we know that's incorrect. So you run into those things where you have to cross-reference names and find out exactly what happened to some of these guys. Elijah Buchanan, as I said, that's a pre-war daguerreotype. A daguerreotype is a silver-plated image, and it's very, very hard to photograph. It's like trying to photograph a hologram. And they basically disappear at the beginning of the war. They're so expensive to shoot. We're sure that that's probably a wedding image of him and Nancy Curtis Patrick, who my sister's named after, I think. So anyway, that's your namesake right there. Not Elijah. The other one, anyway. Well, that's a daguerreotype. That's an ambrotype, as we were saying early, ambrotype. And the ambrotypes are glass images. These two are large, what they call full-plate tins, or ferrotypes. And one of the interesting things, they're both York Rangers wearing exactly the same uniform. So in speaking with Les, after we saw these, we're sure that that's the first uniform they were issued. And later on, they end up with this style uniform that you see in these images.
Is that tinted?
Which one?
The one with the beard there, that one, yeah.
They would color. That's a good question. They would actually colorize them. Now this image here, I didn't shoot from the original. I shot a copy, and years ago, Mr. Lewis Hall, one of our neighbors, he took and had a copy made and colorized it at a modern studio. But in the day, once you had your image done, they weren't like this one should be tinted. And I shot it with Jesse Forrest, who's passed on now. I shot a black and white, so it's a copy. Frank Carmine's had her image, but that should be tinted. But they shoot the images, and then a colorist would go back and color in the details. And some of the images are just beautiful because the colorist was real good, and some of them aren't because the colorist was not very good. You also have details get drawn back in the images. If you study James Forrest, he's wearing a suit. It's a good image, but person is the artist. You have two people. You have the photographer, then you have the artist. And the artist will go back and draw details in. So you see the larger images of people that hang in the ovals or the big square rectangular ones at home. They were done from a miniature. And I've been told by a number of photographic experts that what they would do, it wasn't about the image. The frame salesman would go house to house. In the old days when you had a house-to-house salesman, and they'd offer you a frame. And you could pick what image you wanted done, and they would do that image and put it in the frame. There's a large image hanging in Miss Brooks' house of Lemuel Armour, and it's the same thing. It's been done from this image. So they had a way of doing an enlargement and then coloring in or adding the details in. So at some point, anytime you see one of those at home, at some point there was a miniature that was done from. I think that's that. And the same thing with Billy Tennis. That was done from a miniature. It's a large image. But most of these were all shot from small images.
I was going to ask you that, Tim, because James Thomas Forest has the pencil marks.
Right, you can see them.
You
Yeah.
can see them, and we didn't understand
Yeah,
if it was
that's
a
why.
photograph, why, you know.
Yeah, because the suit's a photograph. I mean, you can
Yeah.
tell. But you'd see that we've got some of the same ones, and we've got some like Bonnie's of Lemuel Ironmonger that we've got the miniature and the large version of it. So you can tell. That's what I was told by all the photographic experts. It was about selling the frame. You know, you bought the frame, they picked it, and then you picked an image. You see the same thing with World War I images. You'll see the big ovals and rectangulars of World War I images done the same way. All right, let's see. Put a map here, which you can't really see, but the area of operations that the men served in started here on the peninsula. They went as far west as possibly Roanoke, not much further, because there were other units that stayed out there, and they went up as far. They didn't do any of the Valley Campaign stuff, with the exception of some of the cavalry units. They went up to Hagerstown, Sharpsburg, Frederick, Gettysburg. Never really were involved in the operations around Washington, D.C., the Monocacy area. They were at Fredericksburg. There's a lot. In fact, there's in a relic hunter's book, there's a plate of a stencil found at Fredericksburg that says 32nd Virginia. It was a stencil cut out of brass for stenciling things. And I don't know where that is now. It would be nice to have it back down here in our museum. But it was found probably 25 or 30 years ago in Fredericksburg here. So they're at Fredericksburg, and one of the things they talk about in some of the letters is they have the great snowball fight in 1862, just before Christmas. And it starts out, and there's illustrations of it. It starts out with 2 or 3 guys throwing snowballs at each other, all Confederates. And then they start adding companies together, so all of a sudden there's 100 on each side. And they start forming their regiments and their battalions. All of a sudden there's thousands and thousands of guys involved in this snowball fight, called the Great Snowball Fight. Would have been nice to do it a couple weeks ago here. It was in Fredericksburg, when they were stationed outside of Fredericksburg. All right, any other questions anybody's got right now? Dick?
Sir, I asked you, were there any Federals that came out of our area?
There were some that, there's one buried in the National Cemetery, and I want to say his first name is James, his last name is Fox, and he was a wagoneer. He's African-American, and he became a wagoneer for the Union Army. He survived the war. He's buried there post-war. His wife might be buried there too. I haven't looked at the grave for a while. But his sons worked at the boatyard, and that's what I know about him. As far as anybody that served as a Caucasian that served with federal troops, I've never found any. And I know there was a family up the road from us, named the family, that was very notorious for turning in men when they were home visiting. And for years, for generations, nobody would speak to the family. They would alert the areas occupied by federal troops by May of '62, and they would say anytime a guy slipped home, because what they would do is they'd come down to Guinea, they'd get him a little bit of money, they'd roll him across at night, and they would land at some of these inlets and come ashore to visit the family, and they'd go back the same way. So they had a pretty good pickup route. I know 2 guys in Fox Hill would get caught coming home that way, and they're taken to Fort Monroe and have to swear an oath of allegiance. Several of them do. Lemuel Ironmonger here, and Buddy, if I get the story wrong, tell me. He slips home, and he lives at the end of Railway Road. He slips home, and the family that's turning him in tells him the federal soldiers come down to get Mr. Ironmonger, but instead of going down to the end of the road to his house, they come by my great-grandmother's house. And they stop there, and she knows Lemuel's home, so she sets him down and feeds him and sends one of the boys through the marsh to tell him, and he gets him in the bottom of a rowboat, and they drift him out into the creek. So when they come, they search the house, but they can't find him. So that's just one, but like I said, I think it's a Johnston and maybe an Elliott from Fox Hill that end up getting caught coming home. So that was very common practice. And even Dad, he still hated his family. He had no direct ties to his family. It just came down so hard about what this family was doing in the area. So, but as far as anybody that served, except for African Americans that served, and Mr. Fox became a wagoneer, and several of them joined the USCTs, because I think it was the 4th USCTs were posted here in Overtown. So they had a lot of opportunities, and then up going up to Petersburg. Yes, sir.
Have you seen any records for Thomas Washington Sparrow?
Yes, and his is an image. I was telling Dave, I had his image digitized. I photographed the image. It's a uniform image. He serves in the James City Troop.
I know he was in Calvary, I think.
Yeah, he's in Calvary. He's in 5th Virginia Cavalry. And his name, before the war, I was just looking at the census the other day, is Sparrow. But they don't like that, Sparrow. I think he doesn't like to be called a bird, so they changed it to Sparrow at some point either during or after the war. So all the records after the war are Sparrow. He survives the war, but he dies and he's buried at Providence Methodist Church.
My cousin told me that after he got it the second time, he was in the cavalry and he got his horse shot under, and then he came back home and turned himself in.
He could have. I don't have. I've got his image.
But the family also says that he rode with Mosby.
Yeah.
I have my uncle Richmond was named Allen Mosby.
Well, he's Thomas Sparrow is actually in the census records in the 1850s. He's in Norfolk, and then they tie in with some land or lumber operations up around Charles City, New-Kent, and he ends up in York County. And I think he's the one. He dies relatively young after the war, and he's buried at Providence. But there's a uniform image. Thelma had a copy of it. Thelma Hansford shot it at her house, and I've always understood the original was on Eastern Shore.
He's my ancestor at some
Okay.
couple back. My grandmother was a Sparrow.
Okay. So it wasn't a Sparrow, though.
No, Sparrow.
Uh-huh.
The one on the bottom in the black and black hat, you didn't talk about him.
Oh, I'm going to save him for last. Saving him for last.
What about CDB?
I haven't seen any of York County men as Carter de Vista. He's talking about it's an image on a card, and they're called Carta de Vistas or CDVs. And you see a lot of them in federals. You see Confederates, especially officers, but I've never seen a York County man. We just didn't have the money to do more than one image. So,
Did you ever come across any images of the War Brothers?
Not yet.
32nd?
I've got a tie or a contact with the Moore at the end of Railway Road that I need to talk to.
I know we always see images of John, which was great uncle of
Right. Yeah, there should be more of them. What surprised me is I work on images across the peninsula, in fact, all over the state really. And for the number of York County men's images we found, I found no uniformed images in post-war of Warwick County men. They all served together, so there should be some. It's just the families are a little bit harder to locate. All right, we're going to move on to this last fellow here. This is Arthur Shields, and if you look at the image, you're thinking, well, that's kind of a strange image. Well, it's an oil painting, and it was done from a miniature, and whoever did it put the same cheeks and lips on him that they put on his wife. Poor guy, and there's an original that the family told me maybe in Tennessee, but he's wearing a slouch. It's a planter's hat. You see a lot of those as opposed. There's another type of slouch there. These are not very protective headwear, and a lot of them disappear as the war moves on, and they go to the slouch hats or the planter's hats because they're more protective from the sun and the weather. Well, Arthur Shield, he's also wounded at Sharpsburg, and he's wounded again at a place called Brook Church. And Brook Church, or Brook Road, is now a section of Route 1 in Richmond. And they're in Petersburg in '64 again, and they send them, and then at some point they're at Bermuda 100 outside Petersburg. They send them up Brook Road to repel a federal assault. So Federals are always trying to break into Petersburg and Richmond. And in that action, that action in Sharpsburg is where we lose most of our troops as far as in one action. And Arthur's wounded again a second time badly. And he keeps a bullet, I think stays in him. And I've always heard the story that after the war, he dies, I think in 1870 after the war, and he coughs the bullet up. And he ends up with tuberculosis and dies of tuberculosis. But he coughs the bullet up, and apparently the bullet was close to his lung. But he's wounded several times where he's a very rough guy, so he's nothing like the cheeks and lips would intend you to think he was. And he gets captured on the way from Petersburg to Sharpsburg, to Appomattox. He almost makes it to Appomattox, and he gets captured. He refuses to sign the parole, so again, they send him. When they don't sign the parole, they send him to Richmond, lock him up. So he ends up there. So he's quite a character. But with this group of guys, there's the Thomas Sparrow image, and I thought I had it digitized. When I found it wasn't, and so because I printed these from the digitized images I have, and I also have one of John Haskins. John Haskins is a full-length portrait of a guy wearing the same uniform, and the Haskins, their descendants, are living over in Newport News, and so it's an early War 10. And Les Jensen found the image, and it was down in Louisiana. And he gave me the names. This was years ago, and I called a girl named Kathy Ebert. Well, it turned out that they were reenactors, and she sent me a copy of this. I do have it, and I just found it yesterday. My secretary is not been working on my images. Somebody would say, do you have an image of so-and-so? Yeah, I've got it somewhere. Because I've got a lot of World War I images and old homes. And when you go to someone's house, they start playing all this stuff. You don't want to miss the opportunity to catalog something. So I keep thinking one winter I'll get it all catalogs and find it. So I just make more copies. I looked in, I was trying to find, I had him Robert White digitized, and I've copied it so many times, I kept finding his image everywhere. It's like somebody was playing a joke on me, just put copies of him all over the house. And I would record me and Robert White, and I would look at him, and Robert White would be looking at me. So I've got those things all over the place. But they're very special, and what was even more special was the families letting me become a part of their life for a few minutes to go through and photograph all of these. This image of Henry Watkins is very unusual because it's on dark glass, and that's why it's a hard image to photograph. He's in a uniform. Image is cracked, and Bonnie Shriver of the Coast helped me, has that image or located. She helped me with a lot of images on the monument from other periods, World War I, War II. I just called Bonnie up, and she said, oh, so-and-so's got it down. I get down, ride around the coast and get the images photographed. Yes, sir.
How much of a big of a part did Mystic Falls play in the Civil War? Mystic Falls, Virginia?
I don't know. I've heard of it, but I'm not sure. It's probably Mystic Falls, not? Unless they were making alcohol, I don't know. it doesn't. What counties is it in? I know places by counties.
I think it was some northern county. That's all I know is up north. It was like that direction.
Okay, so it's probably up in the valley or in the mountains around the valley. I don't know, but it's something I always make notes and I go look it up. I don't know, since our troops probably didn't serve there, and we don't have any ties from that area. I just don't know. I know there's a story. One of the other things I found years ago when I was reenacting, and this ties into Poquoson, this fellow that shoots in an artillery unit was telling me the story about his great-great-grandfather, and he said he was from Poquoson. And he said, we still go back there and visit some of the family, but he comes back after the war. Word had been sent home, I don't know if you've heard this, that he was killed in action, that he had died. So his wife had remarried. She waited and remarried. Then he comes home and realizes she's remarried. So he goes back out to the Roanoke, Lynchburg area and starts another family. And but that family stays in touch, or did stay in touch with the Poquoson family. The last name escapes me, but it's a Boylan name.
Do you have any overall statistic about numbers of people from York County who served, a percentage of who returned?
No, I don't. That's one of the things I ought to do. There's nothing written down anywhere on its totals as far as number of troops. There's some that went into units. I didn't even talk about. There are a couple that went into the Navy, but they went in for short periods of time. They served. We had one, Wesley Messick, that served on the CSS Virginia and the Battle of Hampton Roads. And he survives the war. So I've got other images. There's probably another 30 of men, images of these guys as old men. There's one of Lem here as an older man at the end of Railway Road, I think, taken. And he's standing there, and he's got his Confederate veteran medal on, and he's standing by. I can't remember who he's standing by, but I went down and Miss Edith Lee had the image, and I shot it in her family. Lemuel worked at our yard after the war, and he was this is a side story. He did the lettering, and he had a set of stencils, and he lettered during the war. He would do the lettering on boxes or wagons for the 6th Virginia. Anyway, he did lettering, and he was also a copperer, or the guy that painted the anti-fouling on boat bottoms. And the story was he was ambidextrous. He could get under a boat. They didn't have rollers or sprayers. He could paint with both hands. So he would get under a boat and paint the bottom of the boat in no time using both hands. Well, Years later, we had this old fellow work there named Clarence Charnock from Seaford. Clarence would row a boat across the creek and work at the yard and row back. Well, Clarence apparently was also a copperer, but he was a lot slower. So my grandfather one day was telling me, he said, we know Clarence, he said, Leonard can copper with both hands. He said, yeah, he's dead too, ain't he? That didn't go very far. Another one of the stories I heard of. Leadville here, and another fellow that I don't have a photograph of, Mr. Diallo from Seaford, both worked at the yard. Mr. Diallo was a caulker, and he came from Palermo, Sicily, and gets off the boat. He's York County after the war. Gets off the boat in Florida, doesn't speak any English, doesn't know anything about the Civil War, but he enlists in the 2nd Florida. And the 2nd Florida gets stationed on Wormley Creek doing the Yorktown campaign, and he meets a girl in Seaford, and after the war he comes back and marries her. And all the Diallos in the county are descended from him. He's buried at Grafton Christian Church. But they said he was kind of, they had that Italian hothead about him. And they said Lemuel and Mr. Diallo, Lemuel here and Mr. Diallo would challenge each other and shoot across the creek with their muskets after lunch some days. He said, my grandfather knew them both. He said, between the two of them, they basically fought most of the war. There were some other guys involved, but the two of them basically fought the war, you know, as things went. And Mr. Diallo was also having that Italian hothead. They said he would caulk, and caulking a boat is driving cotton in the seams of a boat. He was the caulker, and caulker doesn't want anybody telling him what to do. So he had this concept is, and they said one day this boat captain had with these wooden matchsticks was going around his boat, sticking them in the seams, and showing Mr. Diallo where he should caulk. And you know, the more he did it, the more Mr. Diallo got upset with it. I think he lived to 1929. It was late in the 20s. So anyway, finally, Mr. Diallo threw his caulking and mallet down, and he said, "Look here," he said, "I am caulk up and I am mock up." I do it all, leave it alone. Lemuel's here. Guy he writes home from Fort Delaware about is Bill Smithers, and after the war, they're both at Fort Delaware as prisoners of war after the war. And I want to make sure I get this right. Bill Smithers' daughter marries Bill Smithers' son marries Lemuel's daughter. So, and Dad knew the son, Mr. What was his first name?
The daughter, Edith.
Edith. But I mean, Bill's son.
Which,
He died relatively young.
Auntie Smithers' husband's name?
Smithers.
Joe Smith. Anyway, Joe Smithers' name is written inside of our barn at the yard, so he would come down there and visit all the time.
He was a pharmacist.
Okay, and he was a pharmacist. Anyway, at some point he wrote his name in our barn. And Dad said Joe could get Lemuel really upset because he would go up and he said, "Mr. Armour," he said, "my daddy and you were in prison or war together." He said, "Yes, that's right, son." He said every time he got sleeping near you, he got lousy. And he would do it to tease me. Of course, Lemuel, then he'd just get up in arms about that. But, he said my grandfather said that was how Joe would always get Lemuel all upset.
I have Joe's book of recipes of some of the stuff.
Really?
I bet you there's a nice one in there.
Yeah. He said I don't know that they probably had the problem throughout the prison. But Joe just did that. And that was his father-in-law. So he probably wasn't getting over very well. Any other questions? I think it's neat to tell the story through the people, and after we're done, feel welcome to come up and take a look at all these guys.
If they signed the parole, I know that those that were Confederates after the war didn't have any citizen rights. If they signed the parole, were their rights restored?
No, if they signed the parole, they were allowed to come home. If they refused to sign the parole, they put them in Liberty Prison or Central Point Lookout. A lot of times they were taken to Fort Monroe if they came in and swore the oath of allegiance. They let them go home. But until something like 1870, if you were, I think it was even a very, very close relative served in the Confederate service, you could not hold office or vote. So for that, which made the Reconstruction period even worse than it was already becoming.
So just to clarify, if you're signing a parole, that means you're swearing allegiance to the federal?
Right, you're swearing allegiance that you will not fight against the country any longer.
Okay.
So
You've
it
been
came-
ostracized at home in that case.
Right, right. And, well, I probably more so in other places. I think with Peninsula being occupied, as long as you came home and just kept your mouth shut, as opposed to family turning people in, they really weren't so much. I know Mr. Hall, when we did the 125th anniversary of Battle of Big Bethel, Mr. Hall, who was John French White's grandson, spoke. And John French White did the prayer when they dedicated the monument there in 1911. So we asked Mr. Hall, we called him Harvey Hall, we asked him to speak at the 125th memorial service there, and we were just there for another dedication not that long ago. But Mr. Hall said that he would go downtown to Hampton with his grandfather, and you know, back years ago, there were still federal soldiers who were at the Veterans Home here, which is now the VA hospital. So there was still the older generation like Mr. White, and he said Mr. White would spit on the ground and he would do anything to not go over. He said he still couldn't stand him, he didn't want to be near him. But again, he lost a brother-in-law in the war, so he never forgave him. He comes home in '64, takes the oath and comes home. He's had, I think there's 4 up here that end up taking the oath of allegiance coming home and not serving any longer. And all of them have had horrible experiences.
Can you tell us about John? And do you know any?
Which one?
John T. Moore?
Right
The
above
one
him.
up, that one? No, with the beard. Your
Oh,
grandmother?
John Moore?
Yeah.
Oh, John Moore's from Pocosin, down the Moore Road area. After the war, either he or his children moved to Hampton. This image is actually in Hampton. Miss McMacken had it. I called, one night I called Betty Alexander, who was the retired librarian of the local history room at the city of Hampton. Somebody gave me her name, I called up and talked to her. I said, do you know of any images? And no, I don't. I said, well, not being smart enough, I don't give her my name. And Betty, I saw Betty last Monday. She volunteers at the museum now in Hampton. And Betty calls me back about an hour later. She said, I didn't have your name, but as soon as we hung up, I thought about this image, and it was John Moore. And it's a full plate, it's a beautiful image. And in fact, I'm glad you asked it, because this is a good story. John is, after the war, he either moves, I can't remember if it's him or his children moved to Hampton, and because they have a good education system there at the time, and he wants his kid to be educated, and many of them moved there to be part of closer to the seafood industry, as far as the retail part of the seafood industry. Anyway, I call this Betty up. She says, my cousin Nancy McMecken, who was a Moore descendant, has an image. So I call Miss McMecken up and I go over there, and she lives over down the street past R. Hayden Smith Funeral Home, and visit her. And we photographed the image, but I go back. A lot of times I go back and visit people when we talk about things, and many times they would lead me to another image. On Darren, I talked to her husband, Bob McMecken, several times. Wonderful fellow, big collector. He had a shed with these old gas pump collections and old oil refinery signs and things that he collected, and he had these miniature marked soldiers from the 60s he collected. And he was a World War II veteran. So one day we're there talking, and he brings out a book on the history of Lynchburg. And I looked at the book and I said, oh, I read that book at my father-in-law's. And anyway, Bob's from Lynchburg, but I didn't know that. And he said, oh, who's that? And I said, Bill Allman. He doesn't say anything. He goes back. In fact, he comes back with a school pennant from E.C. Glass High School, Bill Allman's name on it. And it turns out they graduated from high school together. They used to hang around and build cars together. They were buddies, and when the war started, Bill went off, became a medic in the war, and Bob McMecken went off and joined the Army Air Corps. He becomes a P-38 Lightning pilot. And they never see each other again. So next time, both of them are gone, and next time Bill's down, I take him over there so they can visit. So you just never know where some of these things will be. Any other questions, Bonnie?
Well, not a question, sort of a story. I don't know. You may be able to tell me about when Lem did get out of prison from Fort Delaware. They just said...
Yeah, they don't get them home. It's,
right.
You know.
And Mom's told the story about how...
Cut wood, he asked people if he could cut wood for food.
To get home. Yeah.
He had to walk, and he would just do whatever he could to get a little bit of food to make it. And they didn't know when he was gonna make it home, or if he was gonna make it home, or what at that point, and one day they just saw somebody walking down Railway Road towards the house, and they realized it was him as he got near the house.
And it makes you wonder, some of them that didn't get home, they get parole. Most of the paroles started after April 9th, so you start seeing paroles on the 10th, the different prison systems with parole at varying. I know, I'm pretty sure Kenny Carmine's parole, I think it's dated April 10th, the day after Appomattox, when they just let him go because he's not going to sign anything. But anyway, one of the other interesting things about, let's see, about Lemuel here is he has a brother named Wesley Armstrong. Wesley dies of typhoid here in Yorktown early in the war. And he gets buried in Seaford, the old Ironmonger Cemetery. But his mother writes Lemuel in Portsmouth and says, I've got terrible news for you, or sad news for you. I'm paraphrasing the letter. Your brother Wesley's died of typhoid in Yorktown. So she talks about all that. But there's also letters that go from his parents to Lemuel. And then you've got the ones from Lemuel and Kenny Carmine's back and forth. Well, Lemuel's dad, I think, writes, or mom writes, and talks about the signal system at Ship Point. And he says we can signal, his dad provides lumber from the middle winter quarters at Ship Point. And so we can signal from Ship Point to Yorktown in a matter of minutes. They had a lantern set up. They could signal lantern from Ship Point to York Point to Tews Point, which is off Goodwin Island, Tews Point to Gloucester Point, and Gloucester Point to Yorktown. And if you looked at a map, all the points are clear across water, so they could send a signal from Ship Point, which is in Lower New York County, all the way to Yorktown in a matter of minutes, and tell them, you know, what to watch out for, what's going on.
Was it a code?
It was a code, yeah. They didn't have Morse code. It was some kind of signal code. I don't think there was a standard code. I think they all set their own signal codes. So I've seen another code from Willoughby Spit to Hampton that was totally different, where they talked about they'd show a certain flag when it was safe to cross. That was early in the war. Hampton, of course, is occupied by federal troops before. No, Willoughby Spit's not. It's got a Confederate earthwork on it. So they had to watch when it was safe to cross because of the Federals. Any other questions, you guys? Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.